Hello, thank you for joining us for this week's Not a Podcast, where every week I get together with three of my colleagues and we talk about things that we find interesting in the technology field. And this week we're talking about tech trends, what's happening in the industry, what we find interesting, how we think about finding what next trend is going to be. And this week I'm joined by the same people that join me every week, which is Sharon Bennett, Ray Villalobos, and Morten the Northman. Hello, everyone.
Hey, what's up, Will?
So I thought we might start by talking about, if we're talking about tech trends, how do each of us as individuals determine what's important as a tech trend and what's going to impact our career? What's your thoughts on that, Sharon?
I think as IT pros or professionals, we have to look forward and we have to keep up with those trends. That's our job. That should be part of our job anyways. And so it means that we're scouring the interwebs, trying to figure out what's coming down the pipe, what's new, what's a startup now, where's that going to go? So we have to be doing this, and that will ultimately dictate what our career futures will be. Morten, how do you look at it?
It's interesting because I work mainly in web technologies, which evolve at roughly, a cycle of 2 weeks or something like that. So things are constantly happening. So when I look at trends, I need to try to look way into the future. So a year from now is way into the future in web terms, and figure out the things that are happening right now, which parts of those will continue happening into the future and which ones of them will shape the future. And then how do we guide people into those things? I also try to look at broader things that are happening in the world. Mary Meeker's reports are a very good indicator of both the zeitgeist of what is currently happening, and also looking at what are the things that are coming down further down the road. And it gives you a good indication of tendencies the world is moving in, and then you can try to figure out which ones of these tendencies are worth investing in and what are the good stepping stones to get into those things. So it's complicated.
I noticed. So when you think about what's trending, I feel like there's two timelines. You've got the long horizon where there's really interesting things being done in research that will impact us someday, but then there's the practical pieces that we can actually work with and use, that are going to be usable in the next 6 months or a year or 2 years. I think, Morten, you're referencing that when you talk about, as a web developer, there's all these frameworks coming out constantly and being updated, and you have to decide which one of those frameworks is important for you, and usable and shipped.
It's also just trying to understand how things work. I don't know if you're familiar with the Gartner hype cycle. I've
heard of that.
Yeah, it's this graph that shows you have the innovation trigger and the peak of inflated expectations and the trough of disillusionment and the slope of enlightenment and then plateau of productivity. And it looks at where different trends are currently at and what the hype is around those trends. And if you've been following me, you know that I'm really into digital ethics. Currently, according to Gartner, digital ethics is near the top of the peak of inflated expectations, which is tragic, to be honest, because it shows that we have a long way to go. But looking at, there are people in the world who spend their time trying to figure out where are we going next. And some of those people are far better at doing that than others, and figuring out who is worth listening to is important in this context.
Morten, you bring up a good point. Do you think what we're going through today, being COVID-19, is going to change those trends?
Oh, yeah.
Is it going to accelerate those trends or slow them down?
Well, it depends on what trend it is, but it's definitely, funny because Mary Meeker, the person I talked about, she releases this enormous presentation every year, right? That is the Mary Meeker report, and it's a huge thing, and hundreds of slides that just show what is happening in the world. She released the report specifically on COVID-19, just a couple of weeks ago, where she looks at what is happening right now, what is going to happen, what will happen in the future. And she, along with all the other people that are looking at it, are basically saying the same thing, which is there was normal. That was before. We are currently in no man's land. And then after that is something totally different. There is no, like, whatever we had before is gone. It's still there. It looks like it's still there, but it's actually gone. And we are moving into something completely different. And that means all of us, not just the people who teach things or the people who build things, but everyone needs to think about what are the things that matter to me and what are the things that allow me to be and do what I have reason to value right now and in the future, and how do we build those things into the future? Because everything, it's like someone took the whole game board and threw it up in the air, and right now it's all up in the air. And we're still waiting for it to come down. So right now it's like, well, theoretically it could land anywhere and it could be fine. It could land exactly the way it was when it started. Unlikely, but theoretically possible, right? And then more realistically, no. So then we need to figure out what we're going to do once all the pieces land.
So I think we should...
and gloom. What do you expect from me?
Well, let's keep up with Morten for a second. So Morten, I wanted to have each one of us spend, a few minutes talking about what we think is a tech trend in our part of the industry. I know that you've changed your focus in the last couple of years. You have been known as the WordPress expert. You've done a lot of courses in there. You spent a lot of time studying it, and yet you've changed you shifted much of your content to other areas. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about that process, and how did you see those trends changing?
Yeah, I started out as a web standards person, and then WordPress fell into my lap, and I I invested a lot of time in WordPress to figure out how it works, because I realized WordPress is a good stepping stone for people into web development. It's very easy to set up. Once you get there, you get a slow introduction to how to build your own things. Then a couple of years ago, I realized that we've kind of, in the library, run the course of WordPress. We have the content we need for WordPress. And more importantly, the web is evolving past the old model, which is put your data in a database and then have some sort of machine as an interface between a human and the database, either to put information into the database or to get information out of the database, which is what WordPress does and all these other content management systems do. That model was created 15 years ago and hasn't really changed much. And it has some underlying assumptions that are no longer true. Like the most effective way of serving content is to do what I just described. Have data in one place, have an application to build the pages, and then send them out. What we've discovered through using the internet is that's actually a very inefficient way of doing things, because that interaction between the database and the server that needs to happen before you serve it up means there's an enormous overhead on producing the pages that are served to the visitor, especially when there's a lot of people visiting the site. And then we got into this whole idea of caching content from content management systems, essentially running the system, then caching or taking a picture of the output and then serving the picture instead of serving the output. And then CDNs come online to cache those cached assets all over the world, which then introduces all sorts of problems with how the database is updated and a bunch of things like that. The pushback from that then got, the final result of the pushback from that was the web starts shifting from database-based content management systems to static site generators, which is effectively the thing we did in the early parts of the web, like the late 1990s with the dynamic web templates. And the thing that I'm currently focusing on is Gatsby. It's a static site generator that uses React to generate sites. And what Gatsby does is it gives you all the current best practice modern tooling that you can get your hands on, including React and build tools and everything else, and spits out highly optimized, accessible, static sites on the other end. So the thing that you host on your site is actually just static assets. There's no database. And the database interface layer sits behind the scenes, behind a build process. Anytime you want to add new content to your site, you run a build process that generates new pages. And this introduces all sorts of interesting problems, like what do you do with comments if you don't have a database? There's no relational database, it's all static assets. So comments need to be handled in some way. And it's a really interesting field to get into. It's somehow both a new way of doing things and a very old way of doing things. And it appeals to me in that it's something new and different, yet rooted in the essentials. And I'm seeing the same thing happened with Gatsby and other static site generators that I saw with WordPress, in that people are coming to, like, new people are coming to the web now and saying, I want to build a website. And then instead of going to WordPress, they go to a static site generator because that's what they've been told they should be using. And then that becomes the gateway to get into web development. And then my job is to allow them, lead them through that path to understand things like, this is not new. We have done this for almost 20 years. And it doesn't matter if you're using React, web standards still apply. You don't have to do things the React way. You can also do it just the web way, and it works the same. There are other things available. Like, there are many ways of doing CSS. You don't have to do it the way that some famous person said on YouTube you need to do it. Things like that. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and I'm happy to play my part in that.
So you're saying the overall trend is moving the web to static site generators. And there we go. You're saying the trend is to move to static site generators, and the one that you're focusing on is Gatsby.
Yeah, right now, because Gatsby seems to have a lot of wind in its sails. But, what is it they say on Battlestar Galactica?
I don't know.
All of this has happened before. All of this will happen again. I mean, the web is infuriatingly cyclical when it comes to this stuff. And it's funny when I talk to people who've just been introduced to Gatsby and they go, oh my God, this is such a smart thing. And I'm like, yeah, it's DWTs with React on top. I mean, this is 20-year-old technology with some sprinkling of JavaScript.
That's what happens when you've been in the business. Yeah, when you've been in the business for a while, you start seeing the same trends.
Old, cranky man. I was like, I've seen this before.
So Ray, you're in the web space. Is there? Says, what do you have for a trend? Is it something similar to what Morten has, or something different?
Yeah, I think Morten and I are in similar spaces, but I think we, see things differently. Often, I tend to just really try to look at what's happening by as much data as I can find. So, I subscribe to a lot of things, so a lot of newsletters, and I, go on Twitter and go to a lot of places to look to see what sounds interesting. And I think that I try to look at what is really capturing people's imagination. So that could be something that I look at, for example, GitHub stars, to see how popular a specific project, how often I hear about a project. And then ultimately for me, it's down to, do I think that this project or this technology has a, what I call a killer app, some sort of unique feature that makes it worthwhile for you or for me to investigate. So, that could be just about anything, but to me, the important thing is, have I heard about it a few times? Is it causing excitement? And then I tend to sort of research it. And when I research it, I'm looking for that killer app thing. So whether, in frameworks, for example, we saw this transition from, Angular 1 to Angular 2, then to React, then Vue became a player, and lately Svelte has been making some noise in the space. So each one of those, I think, has a unique sort of killer app sort of functionality that makes it significantly different than the other ones. And that's really, I think, how I determine whether or not I approach, adopting something. So the two things that I have that I think are in my radar right now are something called Dino, which is a project that was started by the gentleman who created Node.js. His name is Ryan Dahl. And so he's got this project called Dino, and that is sort of a rethinking of Node.js, which is really, really huge in our industry. And so Dino essentially has a bunch of features to it. So it's essentially rethinking Node.js. And I think that for me, the killer features are the fact that it does not use NPM, which is really different. A lot of people use NPM day in and day out, and it causes all these different problems. So the way that you use modules as opposed to creating a package.json file that you have to load and maintain and it goes out of date because of updates, you are essentially using the standard JavaScript module system. So what does that do? That essentially eliminates the need for those two files that create all the problems. The modules are loaded into memory and pre-cached. So it's sort of a new way of looking at how you develop websites. I think the huge pain point are, how much of a pain it is to maintain that package.json and package.json lock. Everything returns in a promise. It requires permission. So by default, it's more secure even than Node. It requires permissions for things like file and network and other sort of things. And it uses, like I said, ES modules and other things. So that's one that I think is on my radar. I've been seeing it climb in the ratings. And I think that it could potentially be something that is fairly huge in the future. The other one that I've been looking at just in a personal way is this thing called Tailwind CSS. So this is a utility CSS framework. So you guys know that I do like the Bootstrap course in the library, and that I really love it just because it makes things simple. So this Tailwind CSS, it's sort of like Bootstrap. It's utility first, and you can see that it has like all these classes that you use to create and modify the content, which sounds weird because I think originally we were told not to use non-semantic things in our HTML.
I believe this is called a web standards crime.
Yeah.
Ray,
so,
I'm reporting you right now.
You go ahead. See that I tell you that we have different perspectives, like Morten and I. Yeah. So what I like about it is that it focuses only on CSS. It doesn't, unlike Bootstrap, it doesn't have a lot of JavaScript things to it, which a lot of times when I use Bootstrap in a project, I actually don't use any of the JavaScript or jQuery. I'm just using the styles. So CSS first and only. It's also component friendly. So this is a big difference between it and Bootstrap. It allows you to install it very easily into something like Vue.js or React or whatever other component library you're using. And it's also from the ground up designed to be optimized or customized, so that it assumes that you don't want the default. I think that's one of the big problems with something like Bootstrap, that there's a ton of websites out there just to look like the default Bootstrap site. So this thing assumes that you're going to be customizing it, and it has a system for taking care of that. So for me, the key things are enough people pointing me towards it in the industry. So the people that I follow are people excited about this. And once I realize, yeah, I've heard it a few times and I research, I want to see what the big sort of new idea is that will potentially make this a contender in the space.
I think just to tack on to that, there's one very important trend that's happening in the web community right now, which is worth taking a look at. And that is the trend towards developer experience, or DX, which is where things like Tailwind come from, which is tooling that's designed specifically to make work easier for developers. So this artificial schism between Ray and me on this, like when I say that Tailwind is the web standards crime, it's because web standards is based on the idea that content should be semantic, whereas developer experience is based on it should be easy to build things. And there's a huge discrepancy between what those two things want to do and how they work. And there's a massive war within the community over whether user experience of code is essential or developer experience of code is essential. And right now, the trend is towards developer experience over user experience. And there's a very interesting development that is happening.
Yeah, I've had like a fight with my own brain on this concept of, should you use those sort of classes? And
no, you shouldn't.
I know
we need to have another show on this. Let's move on and talk about trends. So Sharon, it seems to, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it seems to me you do a lot of certification. It seems to me like the certification tracks would naturally lag behind the industry trends.
Are you kidding? No, that's where we go to figure out what's coming. It's awesome. Microsoft has been doing a great job outlining and creating these certification tracks based on what's coming down the pipe. And with Build last week and then a couple of weeks prior to that, they had some really big announcements for certifications. And so if we look at some of those certifications, we can get an idea of what's coming and, where do we actually need to go? Some of the big ones coming down from Microsoft are obviously AI is huge, IoT, data. Those are where we need to go. And Microsoft is building those so we become educated and then we can move forward. So I never look at the Microsoft exams as being the end. I used to at one point, I'm going to be honest. But now I look at the Microsoft exams as being the beginning. And when they come out with a new certification track, that's where we have to start going. Along those lines, we look at learning. And obviously we know with our current situation, learning has changed. My kids aren't going back to post-secondary this fall. It's all online. And it's been really interesting to see how companies and institutions have now having to change that learning and that trend. Where is that going to go? How is this going to change? We are already seeing a trend in online education. My son just finished high school. He did his last 2 years online. And for him, it was a better experience. His marks were better. He enjoyed it. He got to learn things that he probably wouldn't have learned in school. Yes, there's other aspects to it, and that's a whole different discussion. But as we move forward, how is that trend going to change? Not only for the student, because now we have to develop a student or train a student or educate our children to become lifelong learners, because everything is going into collaboration. The days of memorizing the times tables is done. And we as parents, we have to understand that and help our children become collaborators. As instructors, we have to understand adult learning and how that's changing and develop content that meets those needs for adult learners. And our current educators in the K through 12 need to understand and learn how to encourage our children to be lifelong learners. And that means they're going to have to learn the technology plus some of those new skills. So those are some really interesting trends that are coming down. It's going to be fascinating to see where we are in a couple of years and how educators have embraced the new technology, or hoping they're embracing it. And as we as parents, how do we help our children now learn in this new environment? So those two things are kind of what I look at. Again, certification being, the first thing I'm going to look for, where am I going to go? And then how am I going to teach it? As a teacher and instructor, how do I now make that relevant for my learners? And it applies to all of us, I think. Walt, what do you see coming down the pipe?
Oh, well, I see. I want to talk about artificial intelligence. You mentioned that in your segment. Before I get there, though, one of the things you mentioned, which I don't know if you consider this a tech trend, I'll throw this out to the whole group, but work from home obviously is changing the way we communicate, the way we teach, the way we do a lot of things. And as Morten alluded to this earlier, is that going to change everything in the next 2 years? I don't know. Would you call it a tech trend, or is that more a societal trend?
I think it's going to be a combination of both, to be honest. I mean, I can't see the two being separated. I think as we move forward, those two lives are going to intertwine even more than they are now. And that technology and that society are going to mesh. It's how do we, put it bluntly, how do we keep our sanity in that world? How do we isolate one from the other? Because they are going to mesh. And I think for some people that's going to be a challenge, and it could be overwhelming.
And how do we make sure that humanity stays in place in this transition?
Oh gosh, too much philosophy.
Oh,
here.
come on. Sharon started it. I'm like, yeah. Sharon the philosopher has opened the door. That door will never be closed.
There's never enough philosophy for Morten.
That's right.
Yeah, so I think...
Sorry, go
I
ahead.
would say, well, like Sharon brought up the idea of artificial intelligence. I think overall, as a big long-term trend, that is going to be the story of the future, one of the stories, and it's all of its corollaries like machine learning and things like that. I'm in the Microsoft space, so last week was Microsoft Build, and there was a lot of Azure content, but there was also a lot talking about practical current releases of things like their cognitive services, and also talking about research where Microsoft's going. One of the interesting things I saw was a demo they did where you could type natural sentences and it would generate code for you. You'd basically tell it what you want the computer to do as a program, and it would interpret what you wrote, your intention, and turn it into the code. And another trend that I hadn't thought about until we started this podcast is the idea of what Microsoft calls the citizen developer, which is empowering the subject matter experts and the division people at your company that have a lot of knowledge but are not programmers, and giving them the tools to automate their workflows without having to be programmers. And of course, Microsoft's entry into that is called the Power Platform. I did a show, was it 2 weeks ago, on my desktop developer show where we had somebody from the Power Platform team on, and so Microsoft's taking what they've learned in AI, and they're also applying that to making it easier for people who don't write code to have smart, intelligent applications. So I think that we're going to see those mesh more and more as we go along.
This is the trend that they call low code and no code.
Yes, that's
right?
one, another term for that.
Well, that's
Yeah,
right. I know, Sharon, you did some stuff with Power Platform a year or so ago, and have you continued to work with it much?
No, and I'm actually looking for a new side project, as something to do with my free time, as I'm going a little stir crazy. You can only do so many puzzles. And I thought about picking it up again and getting back into it just to get the brain engaged. But I think I have another idea rolling around back there that I might tackle instead.
Right, we're just about out of time. I would also, one other trend I noticed, I had somebody on that does augmented reality. And the fact that, our phones that we're carrying around have so much power now. It's like you can do a 3D model from your phone. If you have the right cameras on your phone, you can go out, walk around an object in your yard. This guy showed he had a yard sculpture. He walked around it with his camera, created a 3D model. He brought it into the HoloLens application. But that 3D model can be imported into anywhere. And again, that's making it easy for people who don't understand CAD, they don't understand 3D modeling. All they know is they want this thing that they want to put in their application. And our technology is making it easy for people to do that. Mm-hmm. And they even added the ability, they link that to Power Platform. So now you can build a Power app that has 3D modeling in it. And I think that's just fascinating.
So in my ethics course, and when I do ethics talks, I always talk about this principle that when you design something or develop something, you are actually building the future for other people through making decisions about what they can and cannot do and giving them capabilities or taking those capabilities away. And what we're seeing here in this conversation and everything else is that technologists and designers are actively designing the future in either consciously or subconsciously to fit with whatever they think the future should be. And when I mentioned that, like on the Gartner hype cycle, tech ethics is on a huge peak right now and is going to come falling down. Tech ethics connects to all these things because the decisions that we make about what we teach, about what we build, about what we publish in the world, and how we allow technology and the advancement of technology to take precedence over whether or not we should do things has a direct impact on how the world evolves. And we as technologists are at a point now where we need to take a bigger responsibility for what we create and for how we shape the world around us through our designs. And the first step in that is acknowledging that making design decisions is the same thing as making decisions for other people about what they can and cannot do. And what I'm seeing a lot of in, both generally in technology, but specifically now in this current environment, is we're very quick to find technological solutions to things without really considering what that does to the human beings involved. And that's the next big hurdle, I think, that we need to cross as technologists, is taking responsibility for our creations.
I think we should do a show in the future that digs into this a little bit more. What do you think?
All about philosophy, I think.
All right.
Then we'll have one viewer.
It'll be like me sleeping and Sharon and Morten doing their thing.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us for Not a Podcast. See you next week.